Hello there, kings and queens, to the King Down 1.5 tutorial. Just as a quick disclaimer, the designer of this game, Sar Shai, has already made a tutorial for this game that he designed, but those are currently outdated and these are the 1.5 rules. So if he ever makes an updated video with the new rules, then I will gladly take this down. Because this game is a little hard to understand at first, because the rules, it seems like there's a lot of rules interacting with each other, but once you get a hang of the game and understand the base mechanic of the game, which is the tolls, it's relatively easy to pick up. So King Down is a chess-like game that uses a chessboard and chess figurines with some new additions. And the objective of the game is not to defeat the other player's king, but to acquire 8 victory points within one turn. So at any one point in the game, you must have 8 victory points. The points don't stack up as you play the game. And the way that you get victory points is by having your units within the capital, which is the center 2x2 square, or capturing your opponent's unit. For each opponent unit you have in your keep, it'll grant you 1 victory point. Now, if you happen to have your king in the capital, he's worth 2 victory points. Or if you have the king or the opponent's kings in your keep, that's worth 2 victory points to you. So at any one point, just have 8 victory points and you've won. So when you set up this game, you can see here that there are 4 different elements: earth, ice, air, fire. So when you start the game, you and your opponent are going to want to pick one of them. The decks for each of the factions are the same, except they all have a unique king. To set up the game, you're going to want to take the deck that comes in your box and pick out a couple of cards. The cards in specific are your king and the pawns. There are 2 copies of your specific king in your deck, and there are 4 unique pawns. Once you have that, you would take 2 of the pawns and add them to your hand. And then the other 2 will make up your deck. And then you take the 2 kings that you found, and they will also make up your deck. Now simply split the 2 types of cards in your deck from spells, which are golden, and units, which are silver. Once you have that, randomly shuffle and deal 14 of these spell cards to your deck. This will leave some cards left out to add variety between the 2 players' decks, because remember, they're both the same except for the unique king. So now that each deck has lost some cards, your deck will be unique from your opponent's. Once you've done that, take the unit cards, also shuffle them up, and then lay them down in front of you from left to right, dealing 6 of them face up. This will make your baseline. Your baseline is the closest row of tiles towards your faction. So you'll simply take their matching figures and place them in the same order that you dealt them. After you've done that, take all the unit cards, even the ones that you did not deal to yourself, and place them into your deck. And then take the 4 pawns and place them in the row in front of the baseline. And it is at this point that you may decide to replace your king with any unit that is currently in your baseline. So you might want to put your king out there or not, because remember, he's worth more victory points if he's within the capital. He's unique to your faction, but he's also worth more victory points to your opponent if he happens to capture him. After that, you'll simply shuffle your deck and draw 3 cards. Once you set up the game, you're ready to play. So to determine first player, you and the players involved will have a slap fight and describe to each other why Mummy loved you best to determine who goes first. The only point being, whoever goes last, proceeding clockwise, will get an extra card to their hand right now. So we'll have red go first. During your turn, you can't move any units as you want freely. You must pay their costs to have them in play, to activate them and to move them, to capture units, so on and so forth. Everything must be done with cards and paying their costs. The point of this game is managing your resources in a sense. So you'll take your hand and you'll have units and spell cards. Now I'm going to ignore just for the moment all these symbols that are under these cards, and I'll tell you how to play a basic card. So the silver units, as we mentioned, the silver cards are units and the gold cards are spells. To play a unit, which means to activate it, you must first pay a play toll. In order to even have this card be activated, you must first pay a card. So, for example, I want to, in my future turn, during this turn, I want to move one of my pawns forward. To do that, first I must play this card. And to do that, I have to sacrifice a card. So a card will simply go into my pawn shop. Now the pawn shop, it's a middleman. You don't need to use it at all. If you want to just put it directly into your discard, you're free to do so. It's just to help you manage how many tolls you're paying in a single round. And then once that's all said and done, you can move them to your discard. So to play this card onto the field, that costs me one card. To move, and once you play the card, I say my pawn. This card has to now connect to one of your pawns. It can connect to something onto the field, or it can even connect to something in yours or another player's keep. This is important for certain cards that touch on that. So I'm going to say I want this pawn to be connected to this one. Alright, so now this card connects to this pawn and no other pawn. So whenever I'm doing my future actions with said pawn, it can only control this one. I can't move the other pawns. So now if I want to move him, that'll also cost me one card. And just like in chess, you have these reference cards tell you how do they move and how do they attack other pawns or other figures. So if I paid one card, I can move them forward because that's how a pawn moves. Unlike in chess, you can continue to perform actions so long as you have the cards to pay for them. So what are all the different tolls that are in this game? To move a unit costs 1. To capture a unit costs 2. To step onto the center 2x2 squares known as the capital, it costs 1. To take an opponent's king, it costs 2. Now these costs stack. So for example, if I wanted to move my unit onto here, I would have to pay the move toll, simply move it, and then the capi toll because I am landing on a capital space. So I have to take my 2 cards, put them down, and that's all I can do because I am now out of cards. So this is very important to note for when many different things stack. For example, if I wanted to take my opponent's pawn here, I would have to pay the move toll to move into that space, the take toll because I'm taking their unit, and the capital because I'm landing in a capital space. So altogether, that costs 1, 2, 4 cards. Now that might seem pretty harsh. You start the game with 5 cards, and I've already had to discard a bunch of them just to move forward and do what I did. But every card, or most cards in the game, have certain symbols. The golden coin symbols represents modifications to the tools that you have in the game, and the shields represent free actions that you can take at any point. For example here, this little pawn says that he gets a free movement and a free take toll, or a free take. So that means if, for example, this guy was out here, I could move him for free and take for free. So that's great. The shields come in handy when it comes to things like that. However, it also says that the costs for the copy tool and the take tool for all other friendly pawns are increased by this much, and those costs stack. So those are the basics of how unit cards work. And that's how the basics of take tools and move tools work. As long as you can pay for those cards and pay for those actions, you can continue to do them. Now, spell cards are the golden cards. They do not require a toll to play. You can simply place them onto your board and they automatically activate. Now, the way that spells work is that they connect to the leftmost unit. So for example, this curse is applying to this peak, which is connected to this unit. So if I were to play another pike which connects to a different pawn, this curse only applies to this. So its effects only apply to this. The curse in this example ignores any text on this unit card. So all this text doesn't matter. So I don't have to worry about costs increasing for other pikes, but their text still matter. And I can apply a spell, for example, to this new pike, and it only applies to this one. I can apply multiple spells to one unit, but they only apply to the single leftmost unit of that. And there is a limit to how many cards you can have in play, as shown by these arrows. One there, 5 cards maximum. If I were to go through with the turn of moving forward twice and going into the capital, that would cost me all of my cards. One to move again, and then one for the capital. That's 3 cards. And then remember, I had to pay a card to just simply play this card. And that would be my turn. Now I know that this has free movements in combat, whatever. You're free to take those if you want, you don't have to. I'm simply showing an example. At the end of my turn, I would draw 2 cards. And for every unit in the capital of mine, I would draw an extra card. So by the end of my turn, I now have 3 cards. And then it would be my opponent's turn. And they would do the same thing. My opponent decides to play this pike. And his symbol is -1 to the play toll. Which means to play this card onto the field, I don't have to play anything. I can simply place it, say I want it to connect to this unit, and now I simply just have to pay the tolls for doing any other actions. So I want to move him, that'll cost me 1. Move him forward. I want to move him once more into the capital. That costs me 1 to move and 1 to land in the capital. Just like that. But those are the basics of how movements work, how units work, etc, etc. And remember, the objective of the game is to have 8 victory points at one point in the game. Right now, my opponent and I have 1 victory point each. So once it's back to your turn, at the start of your turn, you will take one of the cards that is in play on your side of the table and return it back to your hand. And now, the play can proceed as normal. So fast forwarding a bit, let's pretend we're moving our units around, we're doing whatever. Units are getting taken, back and forth. When a unit is taken, so if this pike captures him, congratulations. The player whose unit was taken draws a card. The taker does not draw a card. And then you place that unit into your keep. Now you have a bunch of other units here in your keep. How do you get access to them? Well, if at any point you actually want to use one of those cards, you will, for example, I want access to my rook that is in my keep. I will play the card, pay its costs, and now I am controlling this rook. I want to move him from my keep onto the field. How do I do that? Well, you pay its movement costs. In this example, that rook movement cost is increased by 1. I will pay the 2 cards and move him from my keep to any open space on my baseline. And now he's onto the field. Now remember, this game works a lot like chess. So units move a certain way that are familiar to chess. They can't move through, over other units unless they have abilities that let them do so. For example, the knights, they can jump over other units just like in chess. But for example, this rook, I couldn't move him through my units like this. He would have to go once and stop. I couldn't move him that way, he'd have to stop. So he's basically stuck here. Unless I gave him spells that say that he could jump over other units. There are spells like that. Another complex card in this game is called Sway, where it lets you control another unit, and that can be confusing. But what that means, let's say for example, I play this pike. Okay, that's great. Let's say, for example, this was the setup. I really want to move my queen. She's in a prime position to take the king. And let's just say I had buckets of cards in my hand, but I didn't have my queen. But I do have Sway. Sway says I get to control a friendly unit within my range. And Sway is now connected to pike. So the pike's range is described by its card. If you're familiar with chess, you know that a pawn can move forward, and if it just so happens to be in the right position, it can take diagonally. Even though these are 2 different symbols here, for example, you have the green square and the 2 X's, they all are considered part of its range. For example, here you have the knight that has a red X in its green square, which means it can move to that space and take something on that space. A pawn can only take diagonally, or can only move diagonally if it's taking. But in this example it doesn't matter because range applies to all of those squares on that card. So this means my friendly thorn here is within my range. So now I will control that friendly unit within my range. So now this card no longer applies to this pawn. I am instead now controlling this queen. Everything else on this card is still as it says. It's still considered a pawn, and it still has whatever text is here. The only thing that's different is, for example, the picture. The picture will no longer be this pawn, it'll instead be my queen. Which means she moves the same way that a pawn would. Kind of confusing, but that's the gist of it. Now instead of saying that this card is controlling this pawn, it now controls this queen. But it still acts as a pawn in every other sense. So if I wanted to take this king, I would have to move, I had to pay the take toll, and I'd have to pay the king toll for a total of 5 cards. Like I said, if I had those 5 cards, for example, I'd just throw them all into the discard pile, and bam, I've taken the king. And that would be 2 points in my favor. So 2, 3, 4, 5 victory points I currently have. I'm only 3 away from winning. But it's possible to lose victory points. You know, if they were to take my pawn, I no longer have that victory point in the capital. So it's this back and forth between you and your opponents of taking their units, getting victory points into your keep, trying to keep them, and trying to get units into the capital to try and get more victory points.